Hmm. I have a question for you. Question of the day. May a seller terminate a contract based on a buyer not being able to get their financing? Hmm. That is a question. What do you think? Before I go any further in the video, comment below, yes or no. When or if or may a seller terminate a contract based on a buyer not being able to prove to the seller that they can get their financing. Hi, everybody. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta, and here to answer that video. Please stay tuned to the end where I will demonstrate for you something you need to know. So let me just cut to the chase. As my husband says, Reader's Digest version, honey, Reader's Digest version. So the Reader's Digest version is yes, a seller may terminate a contract if a buyer cannot demonstrate to the seller that they can get financing. However, dot, dot, dot. Now, the rest of the video will explain to you the definite special circumstances under which a seller may do this and the contractual provision that allows a seller to do this. Again, stay with me till the end and I will demonstrate why this is very rarely seen in our contracts today. The contract that I will go over specifically is the Georgia Association of REALTORS contract, specifically the financing contingency exhibits. And for video purposes, I'm just going to talk about the conventional. So we know, and if you've ever watched any of my videos or taken any of my classes, you will repeatedly hear me say that the contract is what? It is a set of instructions. So we need to look to the instructions to see what it is that I am talking about. So, and I purposefully, grammatically use the word may terminate versus can terminate. A seller can terminate anytime. A buyer can terminate anytime. The issue is, are they terminating by default and have to deal with the consequences, the legal and financial consequences of that default, or is there termination by an agreed upon contingency or something in the contract? So today I am talking about something in the contract that does allow a seller to terminate if a buyer cannot demonstrate to the seller that they can get their loan. And you're scratching your head saying, Dana, I don't get it. You've always taught, and I've always learned in every class that the majority of the contingencies in the contract, especially a financing contingency, my goodness, that's a buyer contingency. That is protection for a buyer to be able to terminate and get their earnest money back if they can't convince a lender to lend them the money. Well, yes, you are correct. That's why I'm doing this video. So let me share my screen and go over with you in the Georgia Association of Realtors form, financing contingency, why that, where it is written out, where a seller has those termination rights, contractual termination rights. So let me share my screen. And here we are. This is the GAR F404, the Conventional Financing Contingency Exhibit. And this same verbiage is in FHA and VA and the USDA. So I'm not covering the first part, covered that many times. But here, so I will cover one thing. Here is the time frame that you would put in for the financing contingency period and the appraisal contingency period. And let's say that is actually, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, I have now adjusted my example to make sense for the end. So let me go back and share my screen again. So again, this is the GAR conventional financing contingency. And let's say it gets negotiated that the seller is giving the buyer 21 days from the binding agreement date to convince a lender to lend them the money. If not, they have 21 days to terminate with the seller and send proof of it with a loan denial letter. Now, here's the part of today's video. This is the second page, and in the conventional loan exhibit, it's paragraph 10 and 11. The same verbiage again is in FHA and VA, it just might be a different paragraph number. Right of seller to request evidence of buyer's ability to close. If the financing contingency ends without the buyer terminating, so we've gone past the 21 days that was negotiated in my example in this contract. We're past 21 days, buyer did not terminate. So contract is in place, financing contingency has ended. Now the seller says, okay, buyer, we're past the financing contingency time frame for you to terminate and protect your earnest money. You didn't terminate. Now the seller has the right, but not the obligation, to request that the buyer provide the seller with written evidence of the buyer's financial ability to purchase. You didn't terminate, so now I want some written evidence that you're going to be able to get the loan and close. That evidence is a copy of a loan commitment letter. And there's verbiage in here that says that the loan commitment letter must state the type, amount, and terms of the loan and conditions. So it's a loan commitment with whatever conditions are remaining. Now, this is giving everybody notice that this loan commitment letter is still not a guarantee that the loan will be funded or the buyer will close. Nevertheless, the seller has the right after the end of the financing contingency timeframe to request that the buyer provide them with a loan commitment letter with the conditions. Buyer has 7 days from the date the seller delivers the notice to the buyer requesting such evidence. The buyer has 7 days from that date to produce it. And the seller cannot make this request unless it is within 7 days of the date of closing. It is intended that this this evidence shall be liberally interpreted. Now, look at this paragraph. Seller's right to terminate. In the event the buyer fails to provide the seller with the evidence of the buyer's ability to close within the time frame, then the seller shall notify the buyer of you are now in default, and the buyer now has 3 days from the date of the delivery of the notice of default to cure that default. If the buyer, so what does that mean? Buyer, we're past financing contingency time frame, buyer didn't terminate. Seller now can say, okay, buyer, send me evidence of your ability to close, i.e. a loan commitment letter with conditions. Buyer, you now have 7 days from the date of that seller's request to provide that loan commitment letter. If you do not provide it, so that's 7 days. On the 8th day, the seller now sends you a notice that you are now in default. Buyer, you now have 3 days from the date of this default notice to cure the default, meaning to still provide this loan commitment letter with conditions. And that's what this is, 3 days from the date of the delivery of the notice to cure the same. If the buyer does not timely cure the default, seller may terminate this agreement within 7 days thereafter due to the buyer's default and give notice to the buyer. In the event the seller does not terminate, then the right to terminate on this basis shall be waived. Okay, so this is the contract instructions for a seller that does provide a seller with termination rights if a buyer cannot demonstrate to the seller that they're able to get their loan after the end of the financing contingency. However, let me demonstrate to you why this contract provision is very rarely used. So let's look at a calendar. And before I go on, this is a default. So if this does get invoked in this manner and the buyer cannot provide that loan commitment letter within these time frames, the seller may initiate the termination and release agreement and would get the earnest money because it does specifically say it is a buyer default, and the seller remedy for buyer default is the earnest money. But let me show you again, hang on, why this is very rarely used. So here is my example. Let's say buyer and seller go under contract and the binding agreement date is August 4th. Remember, for example purposes, the buyer has a 21-day financing contingency time frame, meaning they have up to 21 days to convince a lender. If they can't convince a lender, they can terminate the contract with the seller and get their earnest money back if they send notice within these 21 days and prove it with the loan denial letter. So binding agreement date is Monday, August 4th, 7, 14, 21 days. August 25th would be the end of the financing contingency time frame. So remember what the contract said. Let's go back. I'm going to bounce back and forth. The financing contingency ends, the buyer did not terminate. Now the seller can send a notice, can request evidence of buyer's ability to close, and the buyer has 7 days to provide it. So let's go back and look at the calendar. So the end of the financing contingency. This date, August 26th, in my example, is the first date the seller can send notice requesting a buyer to provide loan evidence of ability to loan. So let's say seller requests evidence. So this is the first day they can do it because we're past the financing contingency. Now the buyer has 7 days from this date. Let me add in. This is the key thing. In the contract, we went binding on August 4th, and they had negotiated for a closing date of September 4th. That's pretty typical. Pretty typical for buyers and sellers to go under contract and close within around 30 days or so. So binding agreement date was here, closing date was September 4th. Now back to my example. Seller requests evidence. The buyer now has 7 days from this date to provide the seller with that loan commitment letter with conditions. 1, 2, the date is always, you always start with day 0. So this would be day 0. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now let's go to September. 6, 7. So this would be the time frame that this is the last day the buyer can or should provide evidence. So based on what I've gone over with you pretty repeatedly, this will be the last day the buyer can provide the evidence. They don't provide it. This day would be seller sends notice of default. All right. Notice of default this day because the buyer didn't provide that loan commitment letter. The buyer then has 3 days to cure. 1, 2, 3. Last day for buyer to cure default. Again, this is all based on those 2 paragraphs in the loan contingency. Buyer doesn't cure the default. Seller then has 7 days to terminate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Seller may terminate, between now and the 13th. So based on the terms of the financing contingency exhibit, these are the time frames. However, what do you notice? We are past our closing date. So that is why I'm not going to go over it again, but if you look at a calendar and you cross-reference the days spelled out, you have to start with the financing contingency time frame, 21 days, and you have to look at the closing date, obviously. Then you look at the time frames spelled out in these 2 paragraphs. In the majority of our contracts that we see, all of these time frames don't work because, as I've just demonstrated to you, the issue is that by the time all those time frames work out, we're already, generally speaking, past the contract closing date. So bad news for the buyer: if they can't get their loan, they can't get their loan. Good news for the seller is if the buyer can't get their loan, more than likely they will not be able to show up to closing, and the day after, the seller can go ahead and terminate and get the earnest money based on the buyer not being able to close. But I just wanted to point this out, especially if you are an agent involved in a contract with a long closing date that goes over 60 days, which sometimes we do have those. If that is the situation, then seller might not, if you know that the buyer, let's say you get word from the buyer, from the lender, and there is verbiage in there that the buyer does give the seller the permission to talk to the lender. If a seller gets information that the buyer's not going to be able to get their loan, and there is an extended closing date over 60 days, well, the seller might not want to wait that full 60 days for the buyer to simply not show up at closing and have their house off the market that long. So I just wanted to point out this GAR contract provision and point out that it's there, that it's generally not used in the majority of contracts we see. However, if you are involved with buyers and sellers and there is an extended closing time frame, that might be something to take a look at. I welcome your comments below. What do you think about this? Let me know below, and let me know what other videos you would like to see. And also, please subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of these contract tips or license law tips. Thank you so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Bye. If you like that video, check out the one here. If you like the content on this entire channel, please click here to subscribe. I try to take even the most complicated of real estate situations and make them crystal clear. See what I did there? Real estate made crystal clear. Thank you guys so much for watching.